Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Matthew 5:10-12. All right. That's never happened before. Okay. Welcome to all those returning and all those who are new to Advent Hope. My name is Nick. I am a seminarian at Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, and I'll be your speaker today. So for the past month, Tony and Michelle have taken us through Jesus' discourse on the Beatitudes. And I have been given the task of concluding that story, or that passage. Last week, Pastor Michelle spoke on peacemaking, on the way of justice and reconciliation in a world bloated with suffering. And fascinatingly, it is with a candid expression that suffering will happen that Jesus brings us to a close of his introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. It is in this discourse that Jesus raises to the mind of his listeners a number of powerful subversions. See, these various blessings go against both social and the spiritual posture of his day. To be poor, to be meek, to mourn. These were those who were seen as abandoned by God, those that are playing out of luck, and those who might deserve sympathy for the position of distance from the divine blessing, but also whose position proved them undeserving of it. However, Jesus here, as he often did, unsettled that common perception. Jesus challenged his listeners to see things a little differently. He recognizes what is at stake and what it means to challenge the workings of both Rome and Jerusalem. It is to put himself in jeopardy and to open himself to the suffering of which he speaks. And he shares this with his disciples, that they too, if they are to live in this community he has called them to, will face this. Very simply, Jesus consciously puts the fate of himself and his followers among those who are persecuted. And for me, this provokes several questions. First, who are the persecuted? What do we understand righteousness to be in the context of the Beatitudes? And what interpretation might we draw at present? That is, how does this touch our lives? First, let us take up what it means to be persecuted for righteousness' sake. In understanding this, I draw upon the influence of German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Is anyone here familiar with the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer? All right, one, two, a few, all right. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian born in 1906. He got his doctorate in theology in Germany, then he came to further study here in New York City in the early 1930s at Union Theological Seminary. Ends up going back to Germany and taking on a prominent leadership position and role in the Confessing Church. That is the church that was opposed to the Nazi regime. Bonhoeffer had a staunch commitment to nonviolence. At one point in the mid-1930s, he was actually offered the opportunity to come and study under Gandhi at Gandhi's ashram. However, he turned this down and decided to stay in Germany and continue his work of resistance there. He also had another point where he could seek safety. He actually was offered a position at Union in 1939, came to New York, but then a few weeks later decided that no, his place was in Germany, in the struggle, in resisting what was going on there. And so in his involvement with this resistance in Germany, it led to his eventual arrest, imprisonment, and hanging in 1945. Bonhoeffer's most well-known book, The Cost of Discipleship, offers a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. His understanding of righteousness that Jesus is speaking of here is righteousness of those suffering for a just cause, suffering for their own just judgments and actions. He continues, "It is notable that Jesus gives his blessing not merely for suffering incurred directly for the confession of his name, but to suffering in any just cause. It is the righteousness here of the poor, of the mourner, of the meek, of the hungry, of the pure in heart, the merciful, and the peacemaker. Because here Jesus is setting forth the type of people who enter into his kingdom, for they are the community of God." Bonhoeffer puts it like this: "Having reached the end of the Beatitudes, we naturally ask if there is any place on this earth for the community which they describe. Clearly, there is one place, and only one, and that is where the poorest, the meekest, and most sorely tried of all men is to be found, on the cross at Golgotha. The fellowship of the Beatitudes is the fellowship of the crucified. What is described here is the community of suffering, the place where the divine is manifest in suffering humanity." And so, in dealing with this passage, I think it is important to be critical of ourselves when we read it. I think, frankly, most of us, when reading this passage, like to place ourselves, or I would better might say all of us, would like to place ourselves among the blessed, right? That's the desirous position to be in, one of the blessed. But I think it's important to truly ask ourselves, who are we really? Because I think so often, in our attempt to see ourselves as blessed, to fit this mold of blessing, we might create for ourselves persecutions or tribulations that may not truly be what's being spoken of here. I think we may fail to be honest with our own privilege and safety. And of course, in contrast to that, there's the other side of this: perish the thought that we be among the persecutors. It could never be me. I remember a few days ago, I was, scrolling Instagram, as you do, and came across this clip of Trevor Noah, former host of The Daily Show from South Africa. And this is drawing upon Pastor Michelle's, speaking of truth and reconciliation in South Africa, and the peace and, the whole process underwent by Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela. And so Noah, in this interview, speaks of this funny thing he has encountered in his experience with white South Africans. That is, you never meet a white South African who supported apartheid. They're always opposed to it. They always speak about how evil it was. They would have you believe that they had pictures of Mandela hanging in every room of their house. And I think, the problem is that there is no peace and reconciliation without the difficulty of telling the truth of evil. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, which details the trials of Nazi and Nazi sympathizers, coins the phrase, the banality of evil, which was used to describe that evil does not require malice and hate, but merely thoughtless complacency and complicity. And let me add to this that it also requires a focus on the individual at the expense of one's neighbor, an inability to see one's neighbor's suffering. And so it is at this point that we become aware of a third possibility of who we might be in this passage. You see, I think there's more than just the persecuted or the persecutor, but there's also the observer. One who stands on the outside looking in, staying where it is safe. And I think, if that is our position, if we are on the outside looking in, then at a certain level, this text becomes inaccessible to us. We might have belief and knowledge, but we do not have the experience in our own lives. The blessing of the persecuted might be something we understand intellectually and rationally, but not experientially. So at the beginning of this month, I had the opportunity to travel to Alabama. One of my many things I do, I work with the Episcopal Diocese of New York on the Reparations Commission. I serve as a fellow with them. And every August, the Episcopal Church in Alabama hosts the Jonathan Myrick Daniels Civil Rights Pilgrimage. So the purpose of this trip is to educate young people about this period in history and also to recognize and honor the martyrs of the Alabama freedom struggle. This is my second time going on the trip. I also went last year, and let me say before I get to the main point of this that I love some Alabama soul food. Anyone here from Alabama? I expected as much. Very unlikely to find someone from Alabama up here. But if you ever have the chance to visit, I would recommend also Alabama barbecue. Alabama red sauce, Alabama white sauce are some of my favorites as far as like barbecue go. Each region in the South kind of has its own like little quirks of barbecue, and Alabama's I think is one of the best. But anyways, back to our main point. Moving away from food, I know it's probably almost lunchtime and people are getting hungry, but so while there, we had the chance to visit Birmingham. We went to Kelly Ingram Park, which was a crucial gathering site for students during the student movement in Montgomery, the student marches. We visited the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and we got to go and walk through the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963, the church that was bombed, and 4 black girls were killed in the process. We also had the chance to walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And then in Montgomery, we went to the Rosa Parks Museum where we could visit the place where Rosa Parks was both got on the bus and arrested a few blocks away. And my favorite sites in Montgomery are the Equal Justice Initiative sites. The Equal Justice Initiative was started by Brian Stevenson, an attorney in Montgomery, whose focus in his work is on wrongful incarceration and the mass incarceration of black people. And so in his different sites, he details the history of the Atlantic slave trade, of slavery in the South, of Jim Crow. The museum is a wonderful experience. If you have the chance to go to Montgomery, I recommend you visit all their sites. There's an art garden that you can walk through. And then my favorite is the Memorial for Peace and Justice, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's one of those things that, like, walking through, you just feel there's a certain power to it, almost a sacred element. It hits you viscerally, and it's also haunting. Walking into this memorial, you follow this path that kind of winds you up to this large metal structure with hundreds of these 6-foot rectangular boxes that are attached to the ceiling. And so you walk up this path and you enter into this and you see these metal boxes and you kind of are directed to walk through them, kind of meander through them so they're all around you. But as you go through this, the floor slowly descends. And till eventually you reach the point where they're probably 6 to 10 feet above your head and you have to tilt your head back to look up at them and just gaze at them. But each of these boxes has a list of names on them. And then they also contain a county and a state, denoting, connected to those names. And each of those represents the county and state where the individuals there were lynched and killed during the Jim Crow era. See, these were really, these boxes were really coffins. And they show what it means to be persecuted, not for belief or action, but merely for being alive and trying to live. And I think part of telling the truth of history is that you have to really tell the truth. And that is the only way forward for peace and reconciliation. Letting it touch our own lives is the only way we might be able to move into their experience. To be in this community is to come into the experience of the suffering of others and to join them there. Bonhoeffer could have easily given in and found an out for himself. He had several opportunities to do so, but he decided to resist and to become one of the persecuted in that resistance. History could have, given him a different role. There are numerous, you could look it up, after the sermon if you were so interested. Maybe most people aren't as interested as I am in just the history of theology, but numerous of German theologians who, instead of using their theology to resist the regime, decided that they were going to use it to further it and add some credibility to it. And so I think we are presented then with two choices, whether to join the persecuted in their suffering or to remain complicit in it, whether only by observing or to actively join in that persecution. So while down in Alabama to honor those like Bonhoeffer, the pilgrimage is named for an Episcopal seminarian, a white Episcopal seminarian from New England, Jonathan Myrick Daniels. And so Jonathan answered the call of Dr. King after Bloody Sunday to come to Selma, to join those struggling for voting rights in Selma. And so Jonathan comes down from Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and becomes involved in voter registration work in Hayneville, Alabama. While there, he was put in a jail cell with several other civil rights activists, one of which was Stokely Carmichael, actually. But they were eventually all released. However, he soon found himself with some other activists at a local store where they were confronted by a local sheriff. And, whatever ensued, the sheriff pulled a shotgun out and pointed it at 17-year-old Ruby Sales, a young black teenager. And Daniels shoved Ruby Sales out of the way, shielding her, and ended up taking the shotgun blast to his stomach and dying instantly. He was 26 years old. See, like Bonhoeffer, Daniels also chose to enter into the experience of suffering, which cost him his life. As Bonhoeffer noted, it is significant that Jesus offers a blessing not just for those that suffer in his name, but for any just cause. Righteousness finds itself engaged in the present situation, in what may be just in one moment, may be unjust in another. It's not something maybe discerned for all time, but it's something that we must reinterpret in every situation in which we find ourselves. Thus, we must always be willing to question our own position. Are we living in solidarity with the poor, the meek, and the mourner? We must always ask ourselves, who are the persecuted? And so I want to maybe leave you with some questions here rather than answers. In our present moment in this country, in this world, there are many people at risk for many different reasons. Now I would ask, to interrogate, who are they? Who are the persecuted? Is it families and children in Gaza? Is it, people in Indonesia right now protesting? Who are the persecuted? And I think in our own country, I would suggest that the point of application of evil, the point where evil is touching lives of human beings, is the lives of immigrants. So I think we should ask ourselves, what does it mean to join the suffering of the immigrant? What does it mean to be in community with them? Because I think what it means to be in community with them is it means that we must follow the way of the cross. And so in closing, I want to offer just a little pericope from a Korean poet that I am quite fond of. So in case you're not familiar with Korean history, from 1910 to 1945, Japan, forcibly colonized Korea, and it significantly intensified in the later years of this period. It reached the point where actually the publication of the Korean language itself was banned. But during this period, there also, rose up anti-imperial resistance that sought to counter Japanese imperialism. One person involved with that was a young Korean Christian poet named Yoon Dong-ju. He was born in Manchuria, which, if you're not familiar with the geography of the area, is kind of northern China, just above where North Korea is currently located. But he also, through his life, lived in Pyongyang and Seoul, so, in these different regions in Korea itself, eventually moving for school to Japan. And it was while in Japan that his involvement with imperial resistance work led to him being imprisoned. And while in prison, he would end up dying before the end of the war, leaving behind a collection of written poems. So the poem that I'm going to give you is called Prelude. It is the beginning of his collection of poems. Wishing not to have so much as a speck of shame towards heaven until the day I die, I suffered even when the wind stirred the leaves. With my heart singing to the stars, I shall love all things that are dying, and I must walk the road that has been given to me. Tonight, again, the stars are brushed by the wind. Amen.